Welcome, everybody, to this session. My name is Salina Abraha, and I'm pleased to be your moderator as we go into a conversation on rethinking supply chains at the GLF Investment Case event. We are so excited to be talking about this because the first 2 days of the conference, we've talked a lot about food systems transformation, on the restoration and conservation of ecosystems to address the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. We've heard from farmers and indigenous peoples and NGOs who are doing this great work, but there is a massive role that the private sector can take and should take to develop business models and supply chains that are not only deforestation free and climate neutral, but also operate with a nature positive approach. And this is what we really want to talk about today and dive into further. And we'd love to hear your perspectives. So we have 2 polls that are running in the event platform just in this opening section to better kind of understand where you're coming from. First question is, what is your role in the supply chain and ecosystem restoration nexus, if you have one, and to better understand why you're following this session so that we can really meet your questions and answer them. And the second one is if you've already come across the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. If you haven't, I'll have the opportunity to kind of share a little bit more on what this process towards a UN Decade has looked like, where we are at today. So just to let you know, those polls are running in the next couple of minutes and we'll come back and reflect on them. So before we get into the heart of the matter and present our speakers and the different projects, I want to take the opportunity to kind of start off by sharing what discussions and initiatives are happening at the global level when it comes to restoration and how this kind of links in with the goal of supply chain transformation. So to first start off with restoration, I have had the pleasure of being the Global Landscapes Forum representative to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, where we are a core partner. So essentially, the UN Decade was approved at the General Assembly, and very quickly, colleagues from UN Environment, from UN FAO, and IUCN gathered at our offices in Bonn to basically ask ourselves, what does this mean? What's this new opportunity of a 10-year global effort to restore our Earth? How can we really arrange things in a way that it can have positive impact? So there were many practical outcomes from this workshop, like a strategy development, consultation process, but there was also just a broader understanding that at the heart of it all, this was an opportunity for redemption, to restore our relationship with the planet and all those who have experienced injustice for so long by raising awareness and efforts for community-led projects. And it was also at this time that we began to talk about building a generation restoration, which was initially conceived at a youth workshop, but has now grown to capture the spirit of a movement of any individual who believes and wants to make a difference. It doesn't matter what you studied, what sector you're working in. It's not just the implementers on the ground, but consumers, government, and business alike. So when it comes to engaging business, we noticed there was a growing number of companies interested in investing in forests. So we had an opportunity to meet in Geneva, hosted by the World Economic Forum, to discuss where and how the private sector could get involved. What were the main barriers that they could help us address? Is it capacity? Is it monitoring restoration? Is it involving more young people? And after many days of discussion, we kind of gave birth to the 1T.org platform, where I'm a member on the advisory council. And 1T.org is a World Economic Forum initiative, which is a platform to really help protect, restore, grow 1 trillion trees, but to also help mobilize a global reforestation community, particularly when it comes to engaging and getting corporate actors to make commitments. So it's been really successful this far in being able to have a pledge process where so many companies have been able to say that they're going to commit to restoring and growing more than 2.5 billion trees in over 40 countries. And more than that, we wanted to give a bit of a blueprint to companies who are interested and want to get involved. So I'm just going to take a brief moment now to summarize a bit of the kind of outcomes and highlights from a report that was recently launched called Investing in Forests, the Business Case. How can companies kind of play their part and leverage the opportunity that they also have? So I think the main message here is that conservation and restoration within supply chains is not just good for the environment and for people, but it's also good for business. So I'm just going to quickly break down to you where restoration can meet corporate priorities and where it can bring value to business by breaking down kind of the different realms where corporations work. So there's the corporates that source directly from trees and forests. They have a direct reliance on the ecosystems, and they have an opportunity to reduce their supply risk, protect their supply chains from effects of the crisis, reduce demand risk by demonstrating to consumers that they're taking actions to really restore the planet. There's also a potential for increased business profitability and growth. So when you're adopting sustainable forest management, regenerative practices, there's a chance for companies to really increase their profits. And lastly, there's this opportunity to improve relationships with local partners who you're in engagement with for years and years, right? So focusing on participatory community design and implementation. So that represents kind of the bulk of probably what we want to discuss today, those that are directly sourcing from forests and relying on trees. And just to kind of give you a picture, there's also those who have a low direct dependency on forests. Those are the banks, the private equity firms, venture capitalists that we've heard about in this morning's opening session. And there's an opportunity for values-based leadership to really secure customer trust, to reduce risk, enhance resilience. And lastly, we're not going to talk about this a bit today, but businesses with high and hard to abate greenhouse gas emissions. These are kind of construction, mining, transport, who have an opportunity to look at mitigating emissions in the short term, enhancing business resilience, and also kind of what we see as traditional CSR, which is funding restoration outside of their value chains to kind of compensate for residual emissions or just to build that kind of community engagement element. So at the end of the day, what do we need businesses to do? And we've talked about greening finance and financing green. So yes, deforestation-free supply chains, but we also need businesses to use their supply chains as a leverage for restoration. So we're going to talk more about that today. I don't think I'll kind of take up more time, but let's kind of dive into what investing in-house conservation and restoration looks like along the value chain. So I hope this has helped maybe provide an overview of how and where the private sector can plug in and support the global effort for restoration. But I want to now have a chance to kind of break down the nexus of climate, companies, supply chains with our next speaker, who's going to share what good practices and standards for companies look like to become carbon neutral and deforestation free, and also share what are the new regulatory frameworks that are happening at the EU level, just to help us ground this in something very real and practical that's happening now. So I have the pleasure of introducing Miriam Wolfram, the Director of Policy Engagement Europe at CDP. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Selina. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Excellent. I brought a slide deck. I'm not sure if we can bring this up or if you can already see that. Great. So my name is Miriam Wolfram. I'm the Director of Policy Engagement Europe at CDP. For those who don't know CDP, CDP is a non-profit charity that runs the global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, and regions to measure and to manage their environmental impacts. It's really my pleasure to be here today and to talk about the three main areas, respectively, actors to the protection of forests and nature. And this is businesses, notably capital markets and policy. Next slide, please. So the world can't reach net zero without ending deforestation and restoring land, nor can corporates with related emissions or their investors. So we know that tropical forests loss accounts for more than 90% of global deforestation, with hotspots located in Latin America and Southeast Asia. We also know that deforestation is the source of 12 to 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions, according to the IPCC. And the IPCC found that the mitigation potential of reduced deforestation is up to 1/3 of total global emissions, and all pathways to limit global warming to 1.5 include firstly protecting existing tropical forests, while working urgently to restore degraded ones and to reduce and avoid further emissions. And all emissions from deforestation and conversion of natural ecosystems must stop by 2030 at the latest, if we are to achieve net zero and keep 1.5 degree alive. And companies with forests, land use, and agricultural emissions cannot fulfill their net zero commitments until they end these emissions, which is why the preservation of the remaining natural forests is really key to achieving the biggest goals of the international environmental agenda, which is also what CDP's mission is, driving the transition to a well below 2-degree water secure and deforestation-free world. Next slide, please. So based on industry accepted best practice measures and informed by the accountability framework, on this slide, these key performance indicators are the most comprehensive way to assess corporate progress on decoupling commodities from deforestation, covering all the vital elements from governance, risk management to targets, collective action and restoration. They set out the clear pathway for what is essential action all companies must take to transform their business practices and capitalize on opportunities to protect and restore forests. The KPIs include metrics on like board level oversight, setting a robust public policy on zero deforestation, having ambitious targets, a robust system to control, monitor, and verify compliance with related policies, and engaging suppliers on sustainable production methods. And CDP supports companies throughout these steps, for example, in KPI 14 on external initiatives by supporting market actors to engage with landscape and jurisdictional approaches. Next slide, please. Transparency on deforestation and forest-related risks is higher than ever. That is the good news, and it is vital that this continues to accelerate. That is maybe the not so good news. We're not yet where we need to be. Global supply chains are really key, as we know that the biggest impacts, and that is true for forests, really often sit in supply chains. And this year's CDP disclosure hit a new height. You can see on the graph that there is a steep increase in companies choosing to disclose transparently environmental related information. And what is true for forest related supply chain disclosure must and can equally apply, of course, to disclosures on biodiversity and ecosystems, where positive and negative impacts materialize in a local context, but they need to be addressed at a systemic level by large corporates and throughout their supply chains. Next slide, please. Capital markets, that's the second key actor, hold a power which is key to shifting away financial flows from deforestation and other harmful impacts on nature. In the last years, we have witnessed a huge shift in investors' understanding of the material risk posed by deforestation to their business. But for investors to act, we cannot only rely on their will, but investors need consistent data on corporate impact to inform their investment decisions and also to engage with their investee companies. Data and insights should guide how finance is deployed, shifting the trillions, as we like to say, really away from deforestation and other harmful impacts on nature. The business case is very clear on the right-hand side of the slide, with companies seeing over 50 billion of US dollars in forest risks. Next slide, please. And on the other hand, only 52% of financial institutions assess exposure to forest risks in their portfolio. So setting and implementing no deforestation commitments and policies also represents a huge opportunity. In 2020, just 131 companies disclosing through CDP valued the forest-related opportunities at $35 billion. And according to the World Economic Forum recent Nature Risk Arising report, more than half of the world's GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature. Many businesses are therefore at risk due to increasing nature loss. The most comprehensive global estimate suggests that economic system services provide benefits of 125 to 140 trillion US dollar per year, more than 1.5 times the size of global GDP. And CDP supports investors on their journey to deforestation, to risk or to mitigate the deforestation in their investment portfolios by a portfolio analysis, by reports, research, roundtables, and one-to-one sessions. Next slide, please. And policymakers are the third key actors. The European Union is a very interesting jurisdiction in this regard, having put forward an ambitious proposal around the what to report. So that is a new corporate sustainability reporting rules and standards, and also the what to do under what is called the Sustainable Governance and Due Diligence legislative proposals. And there is the 2030 Biodiversity Strategy that sets new policy goals, such as planting 3 billion additional trees in the European Union. So the main elements are really to improve corporate and financial reporting on the impact on deforestation and forest degradation as a foundation to meaningful action for accountability, phase out deforestation from supply chains, develop business strategies inclusive of a forest risk assessment, and by this support the shift to green finance for sustainable businesses. And on my final slide, next slide, please, it's really halting deforestation and degradation and restoring lost forests is really key for keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees and reaching a nature positive future. The public and private sector must collectively contribute to this aim by establishing deforestation-free and nature positive value chains. And what does this mean? If you're a party representative, you have two concrete ways to drive change at a systemic level. You can talk to your colleagues in the procurement department to introduce selection criteria for your government supplier companies to set science-based emission reduction targets, to make a zero deforestation and nature positivity commitment. And of course, you can end subsidies that are harmful to nature. And if you want support how to do this, talk to CDP. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for bringing in the numbers and also the actionable steps that can be taken. So I think it's so important. It's quite clear to us now. There's many risks embedded in the supply chains, and it just makes business sense to take action. And we've seen this here at COP with so many new pledges and business being engaged at a scale that I think is really unprecedented. And you know, many are taking some inspiration from that, and many have questions on what does this look like? Is this actually going to, you know, contribute to inclusive development? Is this another form of land grabbing? And so I think what we now have the opportunity to do is, through shifting through this next segment on the pioneer perspective, we get to look at what this looks like in practice. So this perspective will bridge the project perspective, the local perspective, which we'll share through short videos, as well as the business perspective. So we have a chance to look at how this works in practice on the ground and in a holistic way. So I have the pleasure of introducing our first project and speaker. We have Mike Senior, Deputy Director of Conservation and Land Use at ProForest. And Mike, you're going to take us through the evolution from deforestation-free supply chains to nature-positive supply chains from your points of view, and share what are the key factors that are needed to transform. So over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks a lot, Selena. So if I could have the slides on screen as well. And whilst they're being brought up, my name is Mike Senior. I'm a Deputy Director for Conservation and Land Use at ProForest. And as Selena said, I'll talk a bit about our work to support companies to transform supply chains to protect and restore natural ecosystems. Thanks. Okay, next slide, please. So just a quick word about ProForest. So ProForest is a global non-profit group that, as I said, supports companies to transform supply chains. We work primarily with the sourcing and production of agricultural and forest commodities through direct support with companies, supporting collaboration with companies and other stakeholders, and knowledge and capacity building. We're a global group with offices in 8 countries, and we work on a range of the major forest risk commodities, particularly on environmental and social aspects, but today I'll be focusing on the environmental aspects of that. So next slide, please. So as Selena said, just briefly on the sort of evolution of sustainable supply chains as we've seen them through our work. So for the last 5 or so years, I think it's fair to say there's been a focus on deforestation-free supply chains, at least in the work that we do, which, as has been mentioned by Miriam, has not really been successful. I think there's a fair acknowledgement from the commodities that we work on in palm and soy and cocoa and others that we haven't managed to achieve that yet by 2020, which was the cutoff date for many of the commitments made by companies, which of course is a massive disappointment. But I think we have to recognize progress that's been made and also acknowledge some of the positive changes that we're seeing. So I think what these commitments really meant for a lot of companies was do no harm in your supply chain. So a lot of the companies we work with talk about no clearance and loss of high conservation values and high carbon stock forest, which is a valuable starting point. But actually, what I think has been learned over the past few years is that really a lot of deforestation is happening outside of supply chains. And what do I mean by that? Yes, it's connected to the commodities that we buy, but actually any given company is mostly sourcing from actors that are already established producers, whether they're smallholders or corporate. Their farm, their plantation may have been established for some time. So you can engage through your supply chain to reach these players, but actually often you don't have the leverage purely working through supply chains to reach the actors and the areas where deforestation is happening, and also where potentially there's potential impact on ecosystem restoration. So you can end up with, if you go on to the next image, please, these islands of good practice surrounded by landscapes where poor practice may persist. Next click, please. And this is why the transformation to forest positive and now also nature and climate positive represents quite an interesting and potentially quite exciting step forward. So there is a growing recognition that doing no harm in your supply chain is insufficient to tackle the problems that we face and the climate and biodiversity crises that we're all grappling with. You need to go further and you need to contribute to positive change beyond your supply chain for forest, biodiversity, people, and climate. And this is something that we're finally starting to see happening with the work that we do. And there's some interesting examples I wanted to call out today. So firstly, the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition is a coalition that's been working for the last year or so to develop roadmaps for what forest positive action looks like for the main forest risk commodities of palm, soy, beef, pulp, and paper. And Proforest has been supporting this initiative to develop those roadmaps. And what they've done is transformed the way that they talk about their supply chains into this forest positive lens. And what that means in practice is that you have to, as a responsible company in the coalition, ensure that the volumes that you source directly are sustainable. So that would mean deforestation free in this case. You also engage with your suppliers to ensure that their operations more broadly are sustainable. And then you also take action beyond your supply chains as well. So you have this opportunity to do that through landscapes and through sectoral change. And it was just announced this weekend by the Forest Positive Coalition, the landscape strategy that will, over the next 10 years, enable these 20 large manufacturers and retailer companies to support this transformation in landscapes on the ground. So that's a massive step forward. And there are other examples of where this is happening in practice that bring hope that we can do more than just mitigate potential negative impacts and restore where damage is done, which is a vital first step, but also be part of longer term solutions as well. Next click, please. And so how does this work in practice and what are the challenges in doing that? So the deforestation agenda has focused on zero deforestation in supply chains, but now as climate comes more and more forefront to the way that companies are acting, they're making commitments on minimizing scope 3 emissions as well. And this is something that a lot of companies have made commitments to, net zero commitments, and increasingly also science-based targets commitments as well. And in terms of their impacts they have on forests on the ground, there are three main ways that they can take action. First is deforestation-free sourcing, which helps them minimize the risk of the volumes you source. You can also have a positive impact through on-farm activities, whether that's regenerative agriculture or agroforestry practices, and also off-farm as well, where you can contribute to restoration and agroforestry, and also avoided deforestation. The challenge is with these approaches is that, as I've said on the previous slide, this doesn't always get you to the heart of where the biggest problems are. So the forest frontiers, in most cases, are off-farm, and some of the standards that are being developed don't necessarily incentivize companies to invest in solutions in these areas, whether they be restoration or conservation. And as I've just mentioned, there is this trend towards companies starting to invest in and beyond their supply chains in key sourcing areas, which is a massive step forward. We know that, and we've heard a lot about the need for public and private finance going into ensuring that forests and ecosystems are protected and restored. And we're finally starting to see that shift in the way that many companies are putting money into initiatives on the ground. And we don't want to undermine that. That's crucial. And there are potential perverse incentives, therefore, if we don't get the right blend of policy measures to drive this behavior. We know many companies do have risk-averse sourcing behavior. So if it's showing that an area is risky for their sourcing, and there are many steps removed from that area in the supply chain, there could be an immediate business decision to just shift sourcing away from those areas. But we know that really what's needed to drive change and protect forests on the ground, restore ecosystems, is not a vacuum of responsibility, but it's companies and other actors stepping up to take positive change and contribute to the solutions on the ground, which unfortunately, in many cases, are complex and take time to develop. So I think, as was mentioned, as some of these new regulations come in, which are ultimately a good thing in step with where the private sector is going, it is important that they get the right balance to continue encouraging investment and support from the private sector into these landscapes on the ground, and don't also drive perverse human rights impacts and impacts on smallholders, who are the sort of backbone of many commodity production systems all around the world, and who often don't have the capacity to meet strict compliance standards from the off and will need support through that process. Next slide, please. And so finally, what does this look like in practice with these commitments and implementing these practices on the ground? So the process that many companies go through is similar to what was mentioned by Miriam, in that they look at their sourcing, they look at the environmental and social risks, but also opportunities, and they look at the leverage they have through their supply chain. So in terms of being able to contribute to a solution, if you're sourcing large volumes, if you have good relationships with suppliers, governments, or other stakeholders in a given place, that's a good opportunity to start supporting change in that place. An interesting shift as well, which is mentioned in the Forest Positive Coalition, is to look at your responsibility as a company. So what is enough to contribute beyond your supply chain? And this is where the term of production footprint has started to come into the commitments that companies are making. And this is where you can really have an impact, because the largest companies start to contribute in a way that's really meaningful and beyond the sort of CSR projects of the past. And that's the process that Proforest has supported companies on in different contexts in palm and cocoa supply chains, to start putting resources into some of these initiatives to work with local governments, community-based organizations, and CSOs on the ground. And in fact, we're supporting 6 production landscape initiatives that cover over 2 million hectares in 6 countries. One of which you'll see a video of shortly is the Asatifi landscape program in Ghana, which our Ghana team has been supporting. It's an initiative led by the Ghana Forestry Commission, and together with our partners at the World Cocoa Foundation, has moved quickly to the stage of developing a landscape management and investment plan. We've also been working in Siak and Pelalawan in Indonesia to work with palm companies to develop a sustainable landscape program there that supports village members and smallholders to manage forests and peatlands more sustainably, and to move towards deforestation-free sourcing in the future. So these are real examples of where this action and these commitments start to translate into real impact. And in summary, the main ways that these commitments have borne out and are starting to drive progress is ultimately by bringing stakeholders together to build multi-stakeholder consensus, set shared goals, and this allows, in the experience that we've had, more forests to be protected, working together with stakeholders on the ground and driving local leadership, which we know is so essential to lasting impact, and companies to bring their support to these processes, but also to restore degraded land as well in some of these cases. And an obvious example of this is through the cocoa sector, where agroforestry and shade cocoa is going to be a big part of the solution to drive nature, climate positive supply chains into the future, but also working to restore peatlands in Indonesia, which is something that Proforest has supported, working with the government of Indonesia's Peat Care Village program. So the commitments are there, the actions are starting to happen, and these are the sort of success stories that I think we need to build on into the future as the decade of restoration moves forward. So that's all I wanted to say, and I don't know, Selena, if we're going straight into the video now.
Yes, we are. Yeah, ideally, we get to hear now from those landscapes.
Esnafo Esutifi is one of the largest cocoa producing regions in Ghana. The management and investment plan was informed by a baseline assessment to identify the key social and environmental issues in the landscape and agreed through a multi-stakeholder process led by the Ghana Forestry Commission. Some actions will be funded and led by the private sector, others by the government, while other activities will need involvement of civil society and communities.
In the said media we bass a pro forest forestry commission and Africa board person mobile ye duanua na ye tebia na ye tekaneno ye sa akọ ye ni gisema nananom ene ya manfo nyina ye so mu se ye beboa ama na koso eno ho anamon ene eguso a ye tu a ye de nioma etoto akwam se ye be hyase na asutifi ne asunafo ya hyase ama manzini nkaye no nso abesua afiri hade akọ mu nso ho akoye sa pepepe ama Ghana apa na ntuma pafira.
The management and investment plan for the landscape will be carried out through a local governance structure. Activities from awareness and capacity building to technical training on agroforestry practices and implementation practices start here within the landscape to ensure work cascades up and out through the cocoa supply chain so that all partners and parties are empowered to manage natural resources in the most responsible and sustainable way.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Mike and the ProForest team, for sharing what's being done in Ghana and also in the other 6 landscape programs across the world. It's just lovely to see how this translates into practice. And I think I saw one of my old forestry friends as well from Ghana in the crowd who's working on agroforestry now. So it's just really nice to see how the global community is coming together in that way. And I have the pleasure now of introducing the second round of pioneers, introducing another project to you, another project, local and business perspective. And so I have the pleasure of introducing Leander Reyes and Kennedy Ntoto from GM Sustainability and Economic Knowledge Unit, respectively, looking at kind of what IUCN, Resupply, and Olam is doing in the region. So I will hand over to you all to share with us your project.
Okay, so yeah, hello everybody, and thanks for the opportunity of being able to present this. So my name is Leander, and I work as an economist now for the International Union for Conservation of Nature on this specific project. Just waiting to see if the presentation gets uploaded. So with Resupply, a project that is funded by BMU ICI, so Germany. What we've been working on in collaboration with private companies is to develop business cases for restoration in supply chains. Next slide, please. So what we try to do is when we look now at landscapes and at supply chains, is really integrate the landscape within this supply chain vision, where we understand that risks, environmental, social risks, in a landscape have an influence on long-term stability of supply chains. So by investing in reducing these risks, you can make a case for businesses to invest in restoration. Next slide, please. So this project where we are really piloting this approach, we've been working on 2 different supply chains in 3 different countries with 3 different companies. So in Tanzania, we're working together with Ilovo on the sugarcane supply chain, whereas in Ghana with Olam and in Peru with Ecom, we're looking at the cocoa supply chain. So starting from a landscape perspective, connecting that with these 2 specific supply chains. Next slide, please. So the project as such, the initial development really came from interactions with companies and donors about including private investments in restoration and how we can show that this makes sense, not only from a environmental and social goals perspective, but it can also make business sense to invest in restoration. And so even during the development of the proposal, the three companies were involved in the development of the proposal, in the revision, etc. And we also did the planning then in close collaboration with the companies to really make sure that the case that we are making about restoration is really aligned with not only business interests, but also in terms of communication, etc. Next slide, please. So we have been piloting the Resupply project in 3 different landscapes, and also focusing on 3 specific supply chains. So one is Wassa and Menfi in Ghana, which is a cocoa producing landscape. Then the Kilombero region in Tanzania, where we're looking specifically at sugarcane, although your region also has other productive activities going on there. And then in Peru, in El Dorado, which is in the Amazon region, where we're also looking at cocoa supply chain. Next slide, please. So a key issue, of course, when we think about linking the landscape with the supply chain is that it's a landscape vision, no? which means that, of course, we still apply what is a way of IUCN of working in these landscapes on restoration is do this through a participatory approach. So it's a direct and close collaboration with our private company partners in trying to understand what they see as the linkages between their supply chains and the landscapes, but also in continuous collaboration with all the local stakeholders. One way in which we then try to identify which are the business cases that make this that make sense is by looking at what do local stakeholders understand and identify as risks, degradation occurring in the landscape. How does a specific company see this for their supply chain? And where do we see potential common interests? Because these common interests is then what we can further develop into specific business cases for restoration. But so there is this continuous and participatory approach, of course, is key in order to have something that is sustainable on the longer term at the landscape level, not only from an environmental, but definitely from a social perspective as well. So even if then we propose specific restoration actions, they have to be aligned with the interests of the company and risk reduction actions of the company, but of course also with the interests and needs of the local communities. Next slide, please. Just to give just two examples of how we've been doing this. So, for example, in the Kilombero region, one of the risks to both the sugarcane supply chain as an issue within the landscape was related to water quality. So when we think then about specific restoration actions, you can think which are restoration actions that will, reduce the risks to water quality. For example, restoration of riparian forests can reduce nitrogen leaching into the environment. So we can estimate and understand different restoration actions and how they will reduce this flow of nitrogen, and then include that in our business case related to the benefits of implementing the specific restoration action. Another example is in Ghana, where soil erosion, so the loss of soil natural capital, was considered a problem both by the company for long-term productivity, but also by the different local stakeholders, in terms of longer-term sustainability of a productive system. A reduction in soil erosion makes sense from an investment perspective, because you are assuring less costs related to inputs such as fertilizer, and longer-term soil resilience. So then we try to look and understand what restoration action, in this case in cocoa, increased and diversified agroforestry systems, how will it reduce erosion, so that we can include that in a business case to show how through investment in agroforestry systems, you can then actually reduce soil erosion rates. So these are the type of things that we have been looking at. So understanding natural capital dependencies, looking at social linkages, and then showing how through restoration you can reduce risk to your supply chain by improving or reducing the degradation of natural capital. So that's what we have been working on with the Resupply project. Next slide, please. And I think in a nutshell, that's a little bit what we have been working on. And I think now there is, I don't know if Kennedy will speak first or if there is first a video prepared by some of my colleagues.
I think we'll hear from the video first. So if we could play the video input to hear the local perspective, that'd be great. Wonderful to see. We now get to hear from Kennedy Ntoso, who's the head of Olam Ghana Cocoa Sustainability's portfolio. I would love to hear from you and what you have to share in terms of how you've made this transition.
Yeah, so thank you. Good afternoon to colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be part of this, and thank you to IUCN. Today, just a little bit of background. Olam today, you can see from our background, is OFI. But for the purpose of this discussion and the Ghanaian context, I will continue to use Olam for this. So in Ghana, Olam is one of the several LBCs. LBC means a license buying company. We have other businesses as well, but in terms of cocoa supply chain, we command about 20% of market share in the cocoa landscape, and by far as the #1 LBC in the country today. We have done a number of activities, and particularly with IUCN. And so some of the key things that we have done in terms of resupply project was first to identify the landscape. And as Mike rightly said, in Ghana, there are a number of high value landscapes which are part of the RED Plus program. So Amenfi is one of such landscapes, and we help with the support of IUCN identify this particular landscape to be able to implement the resupply project. So the other activity which Ilanda also talked about has to do with Olam together with IUCN organized the local communities in terms of having consultations with cocoa suppliers, both those who are within the Olam supply chain and outside. These consultations were done together with politicians, government officers, CSOs, farmers, community leaders, chiefs, and so on. This was done in order to be able to identify what exactly was their needs, and then also prefer interventions. One other area which we also collaborate had to do with data collection, and Linda also said that in terms of social, economic, environmental aspects of communities, and then at the farm level through our own extension agents. So lots of data was collected to be able to develop this business case. Like Landa also said, Olam also support IUCN in understanding how our business model in terms of how we do our cocoa purchases or our supply chain is, in order to be able to come out with the right impact on the landscape. Essentially, one last aspect has to do with our support, trying to come out with other private partners or public partners to be able to bring out the best investments to be able to implement on this landscape. Now, in terms of Olam, how do we do this? We realize that ecosystem is very central to our cocoa supply chain. And I'm sure most of you be aware that recently, 3-4 years back, we launched our Cocoa Compass strategy. And this strategy seeks to lay out Olam's commitment for how we would have a lasting or positive impact on the future of cocoa. So our strategy sets challenging heights to tackle key issues facing cocoa supply chain by 2030, and milestones for action in 2020 and 2024. Some of these targets include having an environmentally positive, professionalized, and quality-focused supply chain, comprising of farmers earning a living income and whose children have access to education. So you can see that this is well within the context of our Olam reimagining global agriculture, which is our purpose. And like Mike also did say in the course of the discussion, you were the one. With sustainability is a very strong business case for businesses to really survive. Without it, it would be very difficult. And as part of our outcome purpose, we have set out 3 key areas, which has to do with prosperous farmers and food systems, thriving communities and better livelihoods. And the third one has to do with the regenerating of the living world. So you realize that these are key impact areas for all when it comes to sustainability. And like I did said earlier on, ecosystem sustainability is very central to, for example, empowering farmers, for instance, in terms of applying good agricultural practices or climate smart agriculture. All this comes under ecosystem conservation. Now we try to look at all this in the context of how can restoration help our supply chain. And you realize that it is not only within our supply chain, it is important that we look at it beyond. And collaborations like the Asunafo Asutifi landscape project is one of them. And there are several other landscapes that Olam is deeply involved in outside our supply chain to be able to bring the necessary impact. Now, before I conclude, I want to say that restoration can really help go beyond the no loss and improve natural capital, such as soil fertility. I mean, reduce chemical use, for instance, biofertilizer usage as an alternative, or in most cases, how to get pollinators back onto our cocoa systems. Because we realize that due to the use of chemicals, most of these midges which serve as pollinators are getting extinct, and there's the need to get all stop these practices. By practicing various agroforestry models, for instance, farmers can get alternative income from other products and improve their own food security, which is definitely part of this whole discussion. Removing child labor or worst forms of child labor and providing them with education has an ecosystem implications. And some of these also includes women empowerment and ensuring that we educate our children. If you have been to our West African region, you realize that most of the distractors come from either children or women. So as part of this whole project, you try to provide alternative livelihoods, put the children in school, finance women to be able to get other income generating activities so that they will stay out of the forest. Now, the final part had to do with Olam and our outsource program. So all this can be found in our digitalized platform we call outsource, which would clearly display, give a full disclosure of what is the journey of the cocoa bean from the farm gate all the way to the shelves. And this is very important to be able to support the process of restoration. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kennedy, for sharing with us the private business perspective, and also for sharing just the sheer amount of, I think, what we're realizing is the consultation, the planning, the discussions, the assessments, the data that needs to be on hand. There's so much that goes into this. And it's amazing that I think it really does require this partnership approach, this holistic approach that we've discussed. And we've gotten to hear now from, projects in Africa and Ghana and Tanzania. And now we get to shift a little bit to the Americas. I get to now introduce the last segment of pioneers. We have Anik Hilbrand. You have worked with FAO previously, coordinating projects in Latin America, Guatemala, and you are now program manager at Oro Verde Tropical Forest Foundation. Can you tell us what the perspective has been like from you working on this project?
Thank you, Selina, and thank you everyone that joins us here in Glasgow virtually today. I really believe that, as well as we heard today in the GLF Finance Day, it is the momentum to include climate, biodiversity, and landscape restoration into businesses. And I think that's what we at Oro Verde have been doing since the last 30 years. So tropical forest, natural capital, and also the aspect on how to include the production countries from the global south and make them fit for this challenge is what we have been doing for a while. And before going into the project, which we will see later as well in a video, let me point out that since I'm here in Glasgow and having been attending a couple of climate change conferences, I think this year we really can see that the private sector is much more visible, but not only visible, but seriously wanting to engage in nature and climate change, mostly until now, for sure in carbon reduction, because that might be the first step, and it's really good. However, the dimension on including nature and diversity is still a bit lacking behind, and that's also the steps which were mentioned by my pre-speakers. So this extra step on not only planting trees outside of the core business, but really including nature and restoration is possible in the business models. And in our project, it's called Forest Values in Guatemala and Central America. We exactly work on these synergies on restoring degraded land with local communities, building supply chain and livelihood incomes, and adapt them to climate change and conserve the tropical forests that is around their areas. And thanks to a remarkable team in Germany from Oro Verde and our partner, Haifer in Guatemala and Defensores de la Naturaleza, we are engaging now with over 2,000 families living in really rural area and building up supply chains such as cocoa, but also working on honey and nuts, which are really produced in land use systems that include native species, quite a lot of biodiversity. Farmers are encouraged to include nutritional plants on their plots. So the way of production is quite different to monoculture. They are able to integrate vegetables, fruit trees, etc. So this point of including biodiversity is very important also for the local producer themselves. And Oro Verde comes into these projects as a, let's say, as an incubator. We have ideas and ideas for business models and our expertise, and then we talk to the local partners and communities what they are really interested in and consult them. And what we felt like is the expertise sometimes is needed to be supported for the local farmers and the producers. So what we do is, for instance, building organizations of farmers and making umbrella organizations, which then who are then much more easier to get technical expertise and microcredits, etc., which then can proceed to steps like buying machines or for drying the cacao and etc., or managing the nuts, which also are turned into flour as so. So that's one point on the ground where we're working at. But it's quite important as well, and as we heard, and maybe later also in the second part of this event, we will go more into the enabling environment, which then at national level is quite important. And then it's not only about incentives for these green business models that can be raised in the production countries, but also the harming subsidies, which also sometimes are perverse of what our positive impact is leading to. So the point I really want to raise in our project, let's be very inclusive. And I think that's the message, and we have a lot of companies in private sector here today. Let's be inclusive when setting up businesses. There are a lot of recommendations how you can engage with local communities and actors there. And just to tell you a bit about our project more in detail, working there, I think also you might have heard that lately there were a lot of migration, people of from Honduras and Guatemala actually facing the issue that they didn't have any future in their country, moving to the US with the hope that they will find a better life. And actually, when we engage with local communities, building up these supply chains, we not only make a positive impact for the climate, but also for the people. So I'm quite happy that we are in a good way of supporting the people living there. But let me raise another issue or another topic we are working on as well in Oro Verde, in the global north, because here we are the consumer side, and that's quite interesting. And when we go in there, and that's why we had some ideas, for instance, setting up a geoportal together with other projects where the consumer gets much more transparency in Europe, because we want to make more visible the impact of our projects at local level. So you can see, for instance, you can zoom in the production country as a consumer here in Europe, or where we come from in Germany, and actually see, oh, where is my chocolate or my coffee from? So you can see actually the farmer, the impact, is there still forest in this area or not? And you get much more into knowing what is actually the impact of the biodiversity and the national parks that are around it, the area where we produce our products. And I think another important thing is how to get these businesses connected to the local level. So we set up criteria for private sector, because we felt like the bubble of the private sector and then the producers is quite different, also the way of speaking and communicating. So we support the private sector in how to engage with local communities and set up some social and ecological criteria. And now in the following two parts, we will see a video that brings us to Guatemala, where one of our partners, together Haifa with Defensores de la Naturaleza, will show actually the effect. I mean, I've been talking about biodiversity and how we include native tree species, etc., conserving natural forest of over 180,000 hectares of land, which is quite huge, by avoiding deforestation and monitoring biodiversity. But let's also see now, first of all, the effect which has it on the local ground. We will see a couple of examples on how income generation can help to protect nature and biodiversity. And then in the third part, we will go to connect all this from the production side to Europe, where then we will hear from Michael Metz from Germany, how he, as a buyer and trader, is connecting with nature positive value change. So please, if I could ask to have the videos to be placed now. Thank you.
My name is Larry Paul Fuentes. I'm the program director of Heifer International Guatemala. And in the last 6 years, we have been working with Fundación Defensores de la Naturaleza and Oro Verde in a project called Forest Values. This project is working with 32 communities in the protected areas of Sierra de las Minas, Sierra Lacandón, and Bocas del Polo Chique. We have been working with these communities in order to improve every one of the stages of the value chain to have better production, quality transformation, and also a good aggregation of the products in order to sell these products to national and international markets. A very important piece of this work is to work closely to get the organization stronger. In these activities, what we have been working is to have the governance of the organizations, the administrative skills, and also their marketing and trading strategies to have success for the selling of the products. We have been working very closely with all the policies and the actors that do the frameworks in Guatemala in order to have a good environmental context. What we have been doing is working closely with the Institute of National Forestry, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, and also the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock. The key success factors of the forest value projects are the following. The first, that we have reliable business partnerships with buyers and traders at a national and international level. They are very interested in the products from the farmers of Guatemala, especially cocoa and honey. The second is that we have a regulatory framework of environment and natural resources that we are taking into consideration for the project, and the governance in Guatemala is very supportive for this kind of projects. And the third one is that we are very supportive in this project to the local structures and the community level, and also the local cooperatives and organizations that are supporting the farmers and also trading the products to different levels. Heifer International and Defensores de la Naturaleza are working together to close the living income of the farmers. A traditional farmer in Guatemala needs $4,600 to fill all their basic needs. But in this case, traditional farmers in Guatemala have an income of almost $2,000. So there's a gap between what they need to earn to fill the basic needs and what they actually earn right now. The gap is around $2,600. And with these value chains, such as cocoa, as honey, as Mayan nut, they are starting to raise their income to close the living income. We have made calculations that a single family needs to have 1 hectare of cocoa or 25 beehives to close that living income. And that's what we are working right now with the farmers in order to have that hectare with enough yield and also to have good markets, good price to close that living income. Credits are very important to farmers. We are actually knowing that farmers need to have money in the right moment to invest in their plots of land for maintenance of the crop, or at the same time they need to have money to harvest the product at the adequate moment. So we have a close relation with cooperatives in Guatemala, financial cooperatives, that gives credit to the farmers to accomplish the task in the certain moment.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for giving us that perspective. It's nice in the digital world to be able to go see what's happening on the ground and to know exactly how much is required to get people to really secure livelihoods. We have the pleasure now of looking at the business perspective, and we have Michael Metz, who's the co-founder and managing director of De La Silva, a cooperative that focuses on marketing products from sustainable smallholder agriculture and forestry. And you've shared that it's your ambition to think about ecology and economy together and mobilize more private capital for these ecosystems. So can you tell us just more about your experience in this project, and also kind of the framing that you have of what's been required to really bridge those two realities and desires that we see? And you're muted, just so
yes, yes, of course. Thank you very much, Salina. Hello, everybody. De La Selva is a kind of a fair trade cooperative that imports and markets products from smallholder agriculture and forestry in tropical forest regions to Germany and the European Union. We focus exclusively on such products which contribute to tropical forest conservation and restoration and have a positive effect for biodiversity and climate. De La Selva emerged directly from these projects of Verde in Costa Rica and its local partners there. We have seen that these projects for the development of local value chains, forest conservation and forest restoration will only be successful in the long term if the smallholders can also successfully sell their sustainable produced products at good prices. And if possible in such a way that additional services, the added value which results from this cultivation for the global community is also rewarded through premium payments. While it is important that farmers also sell a part of their products on local markets to spread risks and dependencies, this financial added value can so far only be paid by the wealthy consumer groups in rich developed countries. Germany and the European Union are very far ahead in international comparison, both in terms of import volumes of coffee and cocoa, for example, but also in terms of consumer awareness and willingness to voluntarily pay a higher price for sustainable products. Even in the market share for organic and fair products, even if the market share for organic and fair products is still very small, the growth rates have been comparatively very high for many years. And the demand for sustainable and ethical products is still on the rise. So this is very promising. And so we see a clear trend that more and more people are buying responsibly. They want to know where the products come from, who grew them, and under what conditions they were grown, processed, and produced. But here too, especially in the sophisticated high-value market, it is no longer enough just to be sustainable and fair or even nature positive. The quality must match as well. This is the only way to have a chance in a very competitive market with day-to-day consumer goods like coffee or chocolate, cocoa. So we are very fortunate in these projects in Guatemala that the products, cocoa as well as coffee, which we are importing, meet all of these requirements for sustainability and quality in an exceptional way. And that's why we are successful with that. De la Selva is the direct link from the producers from this project in Guatemala to the buyers of these products in Germany and the European Union. We provide pre-financing, quality control, marketing, transparency, and traceability. We are able to communicate the whole story behind the products and also the added value of the products in a credible and transparent way. And we offer producers, processors, and consumers to become part of our company to share success and profits as well as risks and to enable a fair and transparent balance of interests. But when it comes to getting out of this small niche and transforming supply chains and business practices so that they enable larger scale ecosystem restoration, we see one problem above all, and it's based on voluntarism and lacks a regulatory framework. Because products that are sustainably organic, fair, climate neutral, and nature positive naturally come at a price. And so far, it has been up to consumers to decide which product to choose and what price they're willing to pay for it. In addition, third-party certifications as for organic or fair trade make these products even more expensive. Finally, this results in an unfair competition because all those market participants who are still allowed to operate unsustainably can produce much more cheaply. And the profits generated are privatized, while the costs of losses and damages to nature, for instance, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, climate crisis, loss of soil fertility, and also exploitation of people, for instance, child labor, health problems caused by pesticides or other chemicals, are paid by society, in other words, by all of us. Therefore, an effective regulatory framework is needed to prevent unsustainable business practices. Only then there can be a chance for upscaling. A new and effective supply chain law at European level, for example, could be an important step in the right direction. But also the suspension of the coffee tax in Germany for sustainable produced and fair traded coffee would be a great help. And of course, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration will hopefully raise more awareness and help to accelerate this necessary transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both to you, Michael, and to Anik, for really bringing us the bridge between the global north and the south, and being able to talk about the consumer side, the conditions needed for conscious decision-making, which is more information, increased transparency to create the right incentives, but also what you touched on now on the market challenges and the unfair competition that is created and has been a challenge for businesses and is adherent to what, wanting to participate when there isn't the incentives really playing out at the end of the day. So effective regulatory frameworks are certainly needed, and it's been great to have had that presentation from Miriam at the front end to discuss and look at what's happening at the EU level. But there's much more yet to be done. So we will dive into a discussion on what is needed. And this is what we'll call the transformative perspective. But we have a moment to kind of take a break and ask our audience a question, which is kind of quite simple, because right now we're hosting this conversation on the one day that COP26 negotiators are all having a break, Sunday. But tomorrow they get right back at it for a final week in a really pivotal moment in year. So we want to ask you, what is your main message to COP26 decision makers in this regard? What is your call to action? And I'd like to ask our speakers to think about this too as we take this break. So that we can bring this into our transformative perspective discussion and being able to really kind of unpack some of the systemic factors and system changes that we need to see that can be driven by decision makers at COP, but also informed global citizens. So we'll just take 1 to 2 minutes of a break, and then I'll come back and get us started. All right, I hope that has been enough time for you to reflect on what's been said today and also think about what needs to be sent out tomorrow to COP decision makers. And I'd like to now ask our speakers to let us know what your key message, what your call to action is to our decision makers here. So perhaps I can start with Miriam.
Thank you very much, Salima. Repeating my call to action that I already made during my presentation, I think it's maybe not that obvious, but a very strong signal to the economy. Get science-based target setting for your supply companies as part of your public procurement activities in your country, stating the obviously obvious end subsidies that are harmful to nature, for example, redirect subsidies for fossil fuels and agriculture, chemicals into activities that nurture nature.
Wonderful. And as a follow-up to that is, I'd love to know more about what you see as the way ahead and which medium and long-term developments you kind of expect to see, especially when it comes to increasing the regulatory frameworks that we touched on at the end. What could be one kind of concrete leverage point when it comes to getting that enabling environment?
There's obviously many, I guess, elements of a regulatory framework. I touched upon some, but I think also one, and that came through in all these presentations that we heard today, this we need that landscape approach, which is a variety of stakeholders that need to be included, and it's very complex. And for companies, it's often companies want to do the right thing, but yet their actions continue to fail to translate into real change. So I'd like policymakers, the local, regional and national, to think about supporting really these jurisdictional and landscape approaches as a key management tool for companies, and really having that collaborative angle between city, states and regions, we would say within CDP, between jurisdictions at local level and companies as a way forward.
Thank you. I hope we see more of this coming up. We talked about COP as being really transformative in terms of how much private sector presence and goodwill has been kind of shown this week. And hopefully we can dive that kind of in the layers deeper when we talk about wanting to be nature positive and how we actually do that. So hopefully we hear more of that coming out of this week's COP. I'd like to now ask Mike Senior from ProForest to share with us what your message to COP is.
Thanks, Selena. Yeah, really interesting presentations. I think my key message would be to be part of the solution and take responsibility for your contributions and impacts on sustainability. And I think, as I was trying to explain earlier, for companies, that means looking at where you're sourcing from, and not just sourcing from low risk areas, but being part of solutions in high risk areas as well. And I think to do that, what we need to go beyond the commitments and start building roadmaps for action as practical as possible. I think, we've got the commitments now, and now we need to translate it into action, and those need to be tailored roadmaps and solutions that are participatory and drive local leadership as well. So those would probably be my key messages.
Yeah, completely agree. And I guess to follow up on that, when we're looking at the how, it's important to, you have experience with companies and you've seen kind of what the barriers have come up, and it's a learning experience for everyone. But we'd love to know, where do you see the biggest systemic barriers for businesses when it comes to transforming their supply chains? And do you think, what Miriam had touched on in terms of new regulatory frameworks and incentives, if that can be a tool to convince more businesses, what do we need to do to kind of tackle that?
Good question. I mean, I think raising the floor with the right regulations will absolutely help. I think, as we've heard, I think you have some companies starting to make a move, but until we reach critical mass, we're not going to see systemic change. So I think raising the floor with the right due diligence regulations for companies will help. But I think ultimately it comes back to the theme of today, which is finance. So I think we need to be supporting those changes with the right kind of investments and be realistic that they take time to build. We've seen from our work, there's no silver bullets. You can't fix it with public or private finance alone. The chasing carbon credits is not going to be a solution on its own. We need blended solutions which take time to build. And I think we've seen from our work that doing that means having stakeholders around the table, and then you can start to build the finance and support that you need to support change on the ground.
Yeah, it certainly takes more time to build, but I feel that it's catalytic in some ways. Once you get the ball rolling, we're on our way. So thanks so much for that. I'd love to now turn to Leander from IUC and Resupply, and share with us from the kind of economist perspective. Well, actually, first, what is your message to COP? And then we'll get into your perspective and what you think needs to be addressed.
Well, I think Mike and Miriam already said quite a lot and made some interesting points. So it's difficult to add to that. But I would say one of the key issues, and what you see that quite a lot and more economists are working on, of course, is understanding a broader vision on the economy. So not only talking about the actual financial capital, but specifically natural capital. And I think COP, specifically now with the adoption of the United Nations ecosystem accounting framework, there is a strong framework to not just include your natural capital issues in a more academic sense, but really, start including natural and social capital accounting in your economies, not just from, like an exercise perspective, but it does have real impact. Understanding natural capital and how it relates to a specific country or to a specific region makes sense. So that would be my main message there, in addition, of course, to what has already been said about financial disclosures and etc.
Thank you so much for that. I'd love to now kind of follow up and ask what, you've touched on the need for kind of a bigger picture look at the economy and not necessarily just looking at what we can do from a regulatory standpoint, and how that will help really, I think, one, communicate to everyone what needs to be done in a more holistic way, so we understand where the puzzle pieces kind of fit together and how nature is at the center. So what do you think needs to be addressed kind of most urgently to enable nature positivity when it comes to our economic system? And does that touch on kind of what you've already shared now on the UN nature accounting?
Well, that's a big question. I would say on the one hand, and it's repeating what has already been said. But at least I see for a lot of companies, regulatory frames and especially clarity around them would already help to push not only like from a compulsory perspective, but that type of clarity can also help companies. So there's definitely that. That one that I think is a key issue, and then without wanting to go too broad or even too philosophical, but I think really an improved understanding of landscape visions is a key part of the solution. And although it's right, I think Mike made the point where he said we have to be careful, of course, that we would not have like I don't know, landscapes with low risk would become preferred versus landscapes with high risk. That's definitely an issue. But of course, on the other hand, given the global situation of climate change, there is unfortunately more landscapes with risks than there is landscapes without risks. No, so I do think that further like integration and understanding it becomes I mean it's a key issue of to move forward.
Thank you so much. I think it's really helpful, and this is something that our audience is also thinking about. I have an audience question that I actually want to ask Kennedy from Olam, and the question that they've asked is really about the impact of COVID on supply chains. So have sustainable supply chains been more impacted when it comes relative to kind of the more traditional supply chains? What has your experience been like over the past 2 years on this?
Yeah, thanks. So we actually realized that COVID has come to more or less get reduced interactions. So previously you used to have this city community interactions, and it got to a stage where this has to stop due to infections. I remember we had to visit a community during the beginning of COVID, and the community members turned us away, saying that we might bring the disease to them at the community level. So you realize that there is that perception of fear and stuff like that. So we tend to affect the psyche and then the various activities of the farmers, and especially in terms of market access. It got to a stage farmers were not able to sell their produce because they couldn't take them to the market and all that. But over the last 2 years, we've seen some improvements, and several interventions have been made to sort of bring everybody up to speed.
And do you think that there's more interest in the work that you're doing and doing that, transforming supply chains to be more sustainable post-COVID? Is that something that you're seeing, or is people kind of turning back to business as usual?
No, the interest is there. We tend to have the solutions. Communities have the solutions. So engaging them tends to bring out these solutions, and then it supports their implementation. Largely, if you don't do it, what we see is that they tend to wait for the central government, tend to wait for somebody else. Meanwhile, the solutions are right there with them. So this engagement really tends to tease out the real solutions, which is more sustainable rather than, bringing a top-down sort of approaches. And this is really useful. People, communities are developed interest, and they're actively participating.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I guess the next question I wanted to ask was if you could give us from the business perspective what your key success factor it has been, and where do you see kind of the largest barriers moving forward?
We have a very strong model. Like I said, I remember I told you that we are present in the entire cocoa supply chain, and we don't sit far away from the farmer, very close to the farmer. And that makes us very unique in terms of our business model in Ghana. That made us also the number one. Cycle time efficiency is very good. Our interface with the farmer, we are very close, supporting at various levels in terms of GAP practices, supporting with premium market premiums, providing them with all the support that is required in terms of additional livelihood. So this sort of approach has really brought us very close to the farmer and has given us success. Essentially, the challenge areas have to do with, we need, Mike did say that, Miriam also did mention, we need to build this sort of partnership. We seem to be working in silos within our supply chain, which is not enough. Building sustainable partnerships like the Menfi, like Asutifi, like SUI, and so on and so forth, will really lead to a great improvement. And lastly, maybe I just want to add that we need to build long-term financing approaches. Short-term things isn't the way to go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope we hear more about this throughout the day, and the plenaries will really touch on the bigger picture. But just, to transition, I want to come to Anik Hilbrand, who I think from Oro Verde, to talk about this. He just talked about the time frame, and it's, short term is not working. So I'm curious, which investment approach is most promising to be able to leverage nature positive supply chains from your perspective?
Actually, maybe there is not really a blueprint, but we looked into a couple of finance models, and coming back to the COP as well, I think there is a lot of finance. I mean, if you have heard what kind of pledges have been made by the private sector, there are a variety of mechanisms and financing available, but nevertheless, we still need more finance for biodiversity and nature. But my point I really want to make is the money is there, but how does it come down to the local level in the production countries of the South? So that's what I want to raise awareness for, that we really need to figure and focus on fair shared risk with the farmers. They should not have a disadvantage working on business models that are nature positive. They should be included. Talking about an enabling environment, we heard here in European Union, we are thinking about having a regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. But if that comes and if this is set in place beforehand, we need to make ready the local South so that actually producers that previously were in the game don't get out of the game. So let's be inclusive and get them into. So I don't think actually there's one way of financing this or one business model, and I think we're on the right way. But let's really look on the ground how this works, and to include as well rural areas. Otherwise, what we saw in our studies and analysis from different investing companies and funds like Atelier and Livelihood, it could happen that it goes anyway into the big existing projects, but we have a lot of potential here. So that's what I want to raise awareness for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love to hear that. And we're just running out of time. So I'm going to come to Michael for the last question. Firstly, love to know what your message to COP is.
Okay. Well, I'm a little bit tired to repeat this all the time, but of course, we need to become serious and take action. And what is really important is forests. And before we're talking about restoration, of course, we need to stop deforestation, and we need to stop deforestation now. And this is maybe my most important message to the COP, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess lastly, which incentives do you think are needed to connect the local and global levels, the progress we're seeing at these different levels, in order to move towards nature positive supply chains?
We need to incentivize the local producers, because they are doing the work. If they work in a sustainable way, growing more trees within their agricultural system, protecting their forests, this is an extra effort for them. Of course, they preserve their own environment, but also they preserve our environment. And we need to reward these extra services provided by the local smallholder farmers.
I think that it's great our audience is agreeing with you, because just seeing the key messages from what the audience has shared so far, it's to eliminate subversive subsidies, to work together, increase transparency, ambition, and accountability mechanisms, and of course, to work with local communities and Indigenous peoples. Thank you so much to all of the speakers, to everyone who's been watching online, to those who shared their message via video from the local perspective. It has been really wonderful to kind of dive deeper into this arena, which truly requires a multi-stakeholder approach, because, we heard in the opening plenary, there's such great complexity in bridging these two worlds and these systems, that alliances are the best and only way to get there. to gather the right knowledge to develop solutions, someone's understanding of consumer demand, someone's understanding on ground realities, someone's experience with community engagement and trust, and all of these perspectives that we heard, the project, the local, the business, in interaction with each other, are able to deliver us the development and climate benefits. But we need COP26 decision makers to act on them and to create the right environment. So I really, really appreciate everyone for being here with us today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the Sunday on the investment case at the GLF, and also your time in prep for COP. So thank you.